Okay, so you want to own a shipping line. Massive steel vessels stacked with thousands of containers, gliding across every ocean on Earth, carrying nearly everything you own from a factory somewhere to a store somewhere else. 90% of world trade by volume moves this way, on ships you can't see, owned by companies you've never heard of, and every single one of those containers is a paying customer riding your asset across the planet. That's the picture. That's the fantasy of owning the actual physical arteries of global commerce, the invisible infrastructure the entire world economy runs on top of. Here's what that fantasy leaves out. The ship you're picturing costs more than most corporate headquarters, takes years to get built and delivered, and once it's in the water, its earning power is almost entirely at the mercy of a freight rate that can swing by a factor of 10 within a single year, for reasons that have nothing to do with how well you run your company. You're not really in the business of moving boxes. You're in the business of betting on a global cycle you cannot see coming and cannot control once it arrives. Understanding that distinction is the whole game. Before we talk about money, we need to be honest about the fact that owning a shipping line isn't one business. It's at least 3 different businesses sharing the same hull design. The first is the container liner model, running scheduled routes on fixed timetables between major ports, carrying manufactured goods for thousands of different customers in standardized boxes. The second is the bulk carrier model, hauling raw commodities, iron or coal, grain, in enormous unstructured cargo holds, typically under one-off charter contracts rather than fixed schedules. The third is the tanker model, moving crude oil, refined fuel, or liquefied natural gas in specialized vessels built for a single type of cargo and little else. These are not variations on a theme. A container line and a bulk carrier operator are exposed to almost entirely different customers, contracts, and cycles, even though both of their assets are, fundamentally, large steel boxes that float. Let's start with the number that breaks the fantasy immediately, the cost of the ship itself. A modern large container vessel, the kind capable of carrying over 15,000 20-foot containers, costs somewhere in the range of $150 to $200 million to build new, and shipyards capable of constructing vessels at this scale are concentrated in a small number of countries, primarily South Korea, China, and Japan, with order books frequently booked out years in advance. If you want a ship built today, you're not just paying the price. You're getting in line behind every other shipping company in the world placing orders at the same time, and that line can stretch 3 to 5 years depending on how hot the shipbuilding market happens to be when you place your order. And here's the trap that catches nearly everyone who underestimates this industry. Ships are ordered based on today's freight rates and today's optimism, but they don't arrive until 3 to 5 years later, into whatever market conditions exist by then, which might look nothing like the market that justified ordering the ship in the first place. This is the single most destructive pattern in shipping history, and it repeats itself with almost mechanical regularity. When freight rates spike, owners across the industry simultaneously rush to order new vessels, flush with cash and convinced the good times will last. Those ships all arrive years later, in a wave, at almost exactly the moment demand has normalized, flooding the market with new capacity right as rates are already softening, and driving the entire industry into an oversupply glut that can take years to work through. You are not just buying a ship. You are placing a multi-year bet on where the entire global cycle will be when your order finally gets delivered, and the whole industry tends to place that same bet at exactly the same wrong moment. Say you time your order well and your ship is delivered into a reasonable market. Now comes a cost most people never think about, fuel, which is by far the single largest recurring operating expense in the entire shipping industry, frequently representing half or more of a vessel's total operating cost. A large container ship burns a genuinely staggering amount of fuel, often well over 100 tons a day at cruising speed, and bunker fuel prices are directly tied to global oil markets, meaning your single biggest cost line item moves up and down with a commodity you have absolutely no control over and cannot hedge away entirely. Layer on top of that a global regulatory shift toward lower sulfur fuel requirements, which force the entire industry to either pay a premium for cleaner burning fuel or invest hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per vessel installing exhaust scrubber systems. And you have an entire category of cost that can shift dramatically due to regulation alone. with no warning built into your original ship ordering decision made years earlier. Then there's the crewing and safety cost structure, which is more complex than most outside industries realize. A large container ship typically operates with a crew of 20 to 25 people, drawn overwhelmingly from a small number of countries, particularly the Philippines and various Eastern European nations, that have built entire specialized labor pipelines around training and certifying merchant mariners. These crews work under international maritime labor conventions governing wages, working hours, and rotation schedules, and a shortage of qualified officers, particularly senior engineers and captains certified on increasingly complex modern vessels, has become a persistent constraint on the industry's ability to staff its growing fleet. Here's the trap that catches even experienced operators. They budget for the ship and the fuel and think that's the investment. It isn't, because ports, canals, and insurance sit on top of all of it, and each one comes with its own leverage over your business that you don't control. Port fees for docking, cargo handling, and pilotage vary enormously by port and can represent a meaningful recurring cost per voyage. And two specific choke points, the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, exercise a level of control over global shipping economics that borders on absurd for two relatively narrow waterways. Transiting either canal isn't optional if you want to avoid adding thousands of extra miles and days to a voyage, and canal authorities charge substantial transit fees precisely because they know operators have limited practical alternatives. When a severe drought reduced water levels in the Panama Canal and forced authorities to sharply cut the number of daily vessel transits, ships were forced into weeks-long queues or expensive rerouting around the southern tip of South America, adding enormous unplanned fuel and time costs to voyages that had been scheduled around normal canal access. And when a single grounded container ship blocked the Suez Canal entirely for 6 days, it didn't just delay that one vessel. It backed up hundreds of ships waiting to transit and disrupted global supply chains for months afterward, a vivid demonstration that a huge share of world trade physically funnels through a small number of waterways that any single accident, drought, or geopolitical conflict can choke off entirely. And then there's insurance, specifically the marine hull and protection and indemnity coverage every vessel needs, which has to account for genuinely catastrophic tail risks, total vessel loss, massive environmental cleanup liability from an oil spill, piracy in specific high-risk regions, and cargo damage claims that can run into the tens of millions of dollars for a single serious incident. Premiums for transiting certain high-risk regions, parts of the Gulf of Aden and the waters off Somalia historically, and more recently the Red Sea amid regional conflict, have spiked sharply during periods of elevated security risk. And several major carriers have simply chosen to reroute their entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope rather than pay the insurance premium and accept the risk of transiting the Red Sea and Suez Canal during periods of active regional conflict, adding roughly 10 days and enormous fuel costs to voyages between Asia and Europe rather than gamble on a shortcut that has become genuinely dangerous. So far, this sounds like nothing but cost and risk stacked on cost and risk. Here's where it gets interesting, because the revenue side of shipping is genuinely one of the most volatile in the entire global economy, and understanding why explains almost everything about how fortunes are made and lost in this business. The core revenue driver is the freight rate, the price charged to move a single container or a single ton of cargo from one port to another, and unlike a nuclear plant's regulated return or a solar farm's 20-year fixed contract, freight rates for most of the industry are set by the brutal, minute-by-minute intersection of available vessel capacity and actual cargo demand on a given trade route. During the pandemic-driven surge in consumer goods demand combined with severe port congestion that effectively removed a meaningful share of global vessel capacity from active service while ships sat waiting to unload, spot freight rates on major trade routes between Asia and North America spiked to levels many multiples higher than their pre-pandemic norms, turning container shipping from a famously low-margin, cyclical business into, briefly, one of the most profitable industries on the planet. Then, as congestion cleared and all those new ships ordered during the boom began arriving, rates collapsed back down, in some cases below pre-pandemic levels, within about 2 years, wiping out much of the windfall for operators who hadn't locked in longer-term contracts during the peak. The second layer, which more sophisticated operators lean on specifically to smooth out this volatility, is the long-term contract, where large shippers, major retailers and manufacturers who need reliable capacity year-round sign annual or multi-year agreements at negotiated rates rather than paying whatever the spot market demands on a given week. These contracts don't eliminate cyclicality entirely, but they meaningfully dampen it, because a carrier with a substantial share of its capacity committed under contract isn't fully exposed to the worst swings of the spot market, in either direction, giving up some of the upside during a boom in exchange for a cushion during the inevitable bust. The third layer, increasingly significant for the largest players, is vertical integration into logistics and terminal operations, where the shipping line doesn't just move the container from port to port but also owns or operates the port terminals themselves, along with inland trucking and rail connections, capturing revenue and margin at multiple points along the supply chain rather than just the ocean voyage itself. This has become a defining strategy for the largest global carriers precisely because terminal operations tend to generate more stable, less cyclical revenue than the ocean freight business itself, providing a genuine counterweight to the wild swings happening on the water. To understand how the risk in this industry plays out in the real world, it helps to look at what happened during the shipping downturn of the early 2010s, when a wave of vessels ordered during the pre-2008 boom arrived into a global economy still recovering from the financial crisis, creating a persistent capacity glut that kept freight rates depressed for the better part of a decade. Several major carriers, unable to generate adequate returns against their debt-financed fleets, were forced into mergers, restructurings, or outright bankruptcy, most notably Hanjin Shipping, once one of the largest container lines in the world, which collapsed into bankruptcy in 2016, stranding cargo on dozens of vessels worldwide as ports refused to let ships dock without guarantee of payment, leaving billions of dollars of goods effectively trapped at sea for weeks while the bankruptcy played out. The lesson here isn't just about one company's financial mismanagement. It's that in an industry this capital-intensive and this cyclical, being the operator caught holding newly delivered, debt-financed ships at exactly the wrong point in the cycle isn't a matter of if, historically, but a recurring structural risk that periodically claims even large, well-established players. An even more instructive case study is the 2021 Suez Canal blockage, when a single container ship, the Ever Given, ran aground and wedged itself across the entire width of the canal for 6 days. Roughly 10% of global trade by volume normally transits the Suez Canal, and the blockage backed up hundreds of vessels waiting on either end, disrupted delivery schedules for goods worth tens of billions of dollars, and demonstrated with startling clarity that the entire architecture of global shipping depends on a small number of physical choke points that a single navigational error, in a canal barely wider than the ship itself, can shut down entirely, with consequences rippling through supply chains for months afterward. Now let's build a realistic scenario. Say you're operating a mid-sized container line with a fleet of 20 vessels, a mix of ship sizes serving several major trade routes. Total fleet value, assuming a blend of owned and long-term chartered vessels, might represent somewhere around $2 to $3 billion in invested capital. In a normal, non-boom year, annual revenue across the fleet might run somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion, against operating costs, fuel, crewing, port fees, insurance, and vessel financing of perhaps $1.3 to $1.6 billion, yielding a modest but genuinely reasonable operating margin in the range of 10 to 15% in an ordinary year. That's a perfectly viable business in a normal market. The two honest scenarios. In the good version, global trade volumes grow steadily, port congestion remains manageable, you've locked in a healthy share of your capacity under long-term contracts at reasonable rates before a demand spike, and you happen to have ships available rather than tied up in an unplanned canal detour when a temporary capacity crunch pushes spot rates sharply higher, letting you sell your remaining uncommitted capacity into a strong market. Under those conditions, a normally modest margin business can post genuinely exceptional profits for a year or two, exactly the kind of windfall that made container shipping briefly one of the most profitable industries in the world during the pandemic surge. In the realistic bad version, you ordered new vessels during a strong market that arrive years later into a fleet oversupply as every other operator made the same bet at the same time, Fuel prices spike due to a geopolitical event entirely outside your control. A regional conflict forces your entire fleet into a longer, more expensive routing around a major choke point you'd built your schedules and fuel budgets around using, and softening consumer demand in your largest market means your uncommitted spot capacity goes unsold at rates barely covering your operating costs. Under those conditions, that same fleet that generated exceptional profits 18 months earlier can swing into a genuine operating loss, with the added burden of debt service on ships ordered at the top of the previous cycle now weighing on a balance sheet earning a fraction of what it did at the peak. The gap between these two scenarios across a fleet this size can be well over $1 billion in a single year, and unlike almost any other business in this genre, that swing has essentially nothing to do with how well or poorly you actually ran your company day to day. So why, given all of this brutal cyclicality, capital intensity, and exposure to choke points you don't control, do sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and industrial conglomerates keep buying and building shipping lines? Because global trade over any sufficiently long time horizon keeps growing, and whoever owns the ships that physically move it captures a toll on that growth that no amount of digital disruption has managed to eliminate or even meaningfully dent, given that the physical act of moving a container of goods across an ocean still requires, quite literally, a ship. The operators who survive multiple cycles, rather than getting wiped out in the down years, tend to be the ones disciplined enough to avoid ordering new capacity at the top of the market, the exact temptation that has sunk so many competitors before them, and that discipline, more than any single technological or operational advantage, is what actually separates the shipping lines that compound wealth across decades from the ones that cycle in and out of bankruptcy every 10 or 15 years. Like clockwork. Which brings us back to the picture we started with. The massive steel vessels stacked with containers, gliding across every ocean, quietly carrying nearly everything you own. That part of the fantasy is, in a narrow sense, true. A well-run shipping line that survives multiple cycles without overextending at the wrong moment genuinely does own a toll booth on global trade that nothing else has fully replaced. But getting there means surviving a multi-year ordering and delivery cycle that tends to deliver new ships into exactly the wrong market, accepting that your largest cost, fuel, moves with a commodity you cannot control, and understanding that a single grounded ship in a canal barely wider than itself can disrupt your entire schedule regardless of how well you've run every other part of the business. The people who make real money in this industry aren't the ones who built the biggest fleet at the top of the market. They're the ones who understood, going in, that they weren't really in the shipping business. They were in the business of surviving a cycle that repeats itself roughly once a decade, whether or not anyone in the industry has learned the lesson from the last one.